I'm sure by this point, most of you have already read what's in Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal proposal. And I'm sure all the other progressive independent media outlets are going to do a line-by-line breakdown of what's in this proposal. So I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to give a real in-depth breakdown of some of the most amazing parts of Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal proposal, where I think he really breaks the mold for what's been the range of policies that people consider realistic and pragmatic solutions to address the climate crisis that we're in right now. So the first thing I want to talk about are the 20 million jobs that Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal proposal is expected to create. Look, the reality is, if we're going to address this climate crisis that we're in right now, it is going to require new technology and new infrastructure across the country. And that new infrastructure and technology that we use to address the climate crisis isn't just going to appear and manifest out of nowhere. It is going to be created by jobs. So really, the hallmark of any serious climate policy, this is how you can tell if somebody's climate policy will actually get to the root of the problem. Any serious climate proposal would have to factor in the creation of millions of jobs, because it is just impossible to get to zero carbon emissions with the current amount of workers that we have in the clean energy sector. We're going to need to add millions more jobs in that sector if we're going to make a serious effort to get to zero carbon emissions. Now, some of the jobs that would be created in Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal proposal would be manufacturing jobs to build energy efficient cars and boats, as well as charging stations for electric cars, I'm assuming. Energy efficiency, retrofitting of homes. So people are going to have to basically go to every home and building in the United States and reconfigure it so that it's more energy efficient and it doesn't run off of fossil fuel. Sustainable agriculture, engineering, research and development of new green technology. And a very important part of the jobs created in this Green New Deal proposal from Bernie Sanders is that he's going to allocate $1.3 trillion for workers currently in the fossil fuel industry to finding them other good paying jobs with good benefits and a living wage. These will be good jobs with good benefits. We're talking about minimum $15 an hour. So the economic upsides to Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal it would be unprecedented. You'd be creating 20 million jobs paying minimum $15 an hour with a whole host of other benefits. And he's going to prioritize people in low income communities for these jobs. So we talk about the numbers on this show pretty often, the numbers that give a real picture of the economy in the United States. 50% of U.S. households make $30,000 a year or less. 75% of households in the United States live paycheck to paycheck. 70% of households can't afford a $500 or $700 emergency without going into debt. There are millions of working poor people in the United States, people who are working full-time jobs, people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, people working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and they still can't pay their rent, they still can't afford to put food on the table and all the other expenses that they have. The economic picture in the United States is ghastly, and millions of people in this country are hanging on by a thread. And 20 million jobs created by this Green New Deal paying a living wage would be a game changer. And in a way, this is a form of a federal job guarantee, because Bernie Sanders in his proposal says if this thing were to pass, it would eliminate unemployment in the United States. And that's true, because anybody who is willing to work and wants a living wage will be able to sign up for one of these jobs, any one of these millions of jobs that will be created, and there are going to be more jobs than people able to fill those positions. So people will always be able to get a job, no matter what their skill level is, no matter what their education level is. They'll be able to get a job in this green economy. So there's this straw man of when people try to talk about a federal job guarantee that, oh, that's some real commie shit. That's some communist shit where, you know, the government's going to eliminate the private sector and the government's just going to be producing everything just to guarantee a job for everybody. So the government's going to be making frivolous shit like shoes and TVs and couches and all that stuff and eliminate the private sector altogether. No, that's not what we're talking about. When we're talking about a federal job guarantee, we mean, or at least the people on the left that follow and are most prominent in left-wing circles, when they're talking about a federal job guarantee, usually it's tied to combating climate change, because like I spoke about, the level of the crisis that we're in is going to require a massive effort by the United States that's going to create millions of jobs. So when we say federal jobs guarantee, we're not talking about the federal government is just going to pay people to stand around and do nothing. It means we're going to fix the infrastructure and the problems that we have in the United States, and to do so, we're going to need jobs to do it. There's going to be more jobs than people willing to fill them. So it is, by definition, you are guaranteed a job if you want a job. And this also just completely destroys this false idea that people associate with combating climate change, that it's going to cost an extraordinary amount of money and it's going to be a giant hit to the economy, and we're going to spend so much money on this problem. We might not even have enough money to address climate change. First of all, I don't agree with that because of modern monetary theory. But aside from that, actually combating climate change is going to create 20 million jobs. The right wing likes to point to job creation and high stock market prices as if they're the best indicators in how the economy is doing. So if job creation is their holy grail, it's the best thing you can do to help the economy out, and combating climate change is going to create 20 million jobs, how can you make the argument that climate change is going to be a negative for the U.S. economically? The next part of Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal proposal that I think is incredibly important is his call for accountability. Bernie Sanders is going after the fossil fuel industry with the full force of the federal government. Bernie Sanders says he will instruct his Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to conduct criminal investigations into the fossil fuel industry. This is a quote from Bernie Sanders. Quote, "They have evaded taxes, desecrated tribal lands, exploited workers, and poisoned communities." All of that is true and not even up for debate at this point. Anybody who is going to make the argument that the fossil fuel industry doesn't do all of those things in spades is either being paid by the fossil fuel industry, or they're just dumb enough to buy their propaganda hook, line, and sinker. We know that there have been multiple reports exposing companies like Exxon hiding billions of dollars in overseas accounts to avoid paying taxes in the United States. In Standing Rock, they just, through the sheer force of corruption and corporate greed, they built their pipeline illegally. Energy Transfer Partner built the Dakota Access Pipeline illegally through the land that was given to the Native Americans by the U.S. government. So this is Native American land and is federally protected. Energy Transfer Partner said, "Fuck that shit. We're going to build this pipeline anyway because we want that oil money." And they just did it with no repercussions, no federal charges being brought. The FBI, the Department of Justice, didn't say a goddamn word about it, even though it was brazenly illegal. And poisoning communities, that's obvious. That is just obvious at this point. Fracking, all the stories we hear about the neighborhoods where they're doing the fracking, the natural gas is getting into the water lines. People's water, if you turn on the water, the tap, you can catch it on fire. That's because the chemicals from the fracking is getting into the water. The giant oil spills that happen off the coast of the United States. The incidents that happened in Texas after there was a hurricane, some of these chemical plants and fossil fuel companies, the infrastructure that they had built wasn't equipped to deal with that severe weather, and there were explosions, there were leaks, chemicals were getting into the air and into the water and poisoning people. And every single one of those cases is not by an accident or anything like that. It is, these companies have made the calculation that regardless of the health effects that of the work that they're doing is causing, regardless, it doesn't matter. Their profits come above all of that. Their profits come above everything. So it is a calculated decision that they've made to continue operating in the way that they do, even though it's killing people. It is literally killing people through the pollution and all that shit. Donald Trump, one of the first things he did when he came into the White House in 2017, he got rid of a rule from the Obama administration that prevented coal companies from dumping their toxic ash into streams and waterways in the United States. So Donald Trump just got rid of that, and they went right back to, or they continued dumping these toxic chemicals in waterways. So they're so brazen about it. They're so brazen about it that if any prosecutor's office were to do a mild look under the rug, there's just a litany of felonies and cases of negligence and all these other things that Bernie Sanders wants to be investigated by the Department of Justice. These are some of the largest criminal organizations in the world, these fossil fuel corporations, because you have to understand what they're doing. We cannot wrap our minds around the scale, the gravity of the crime that they're committing. They are literally destroying the planet so they can make billions of dollars in profit. They know this. We have all the leaked emails from back in the 90s of people and executives in Exxon talking to the researchers and scientists and all this stuff, who explain to them the risk of climate change and what the fossil fuels are doing to the environment. Knowing that, they said, fuck it, we're going to do it anyway, and continued to make trillions of dollars in profit up until now, 2019. And we are at the brink of just completely destroying what's left of the environment. It was intentional, and it was for profit and greed and corruption. And those deliberate actions are going to lead to the deaths of millions of people, millions of animals. It's going to change the way the world functions. It's going to create crises that we can't even imagine yet. We can't even wrap our heads around. And they did it on purpose. If anything is a crime against humanity, it would be that. It would be what the fossil fuel industry has done to the world for the last however many decades. So again, this is something that any serious plan to address climate change is going to have to include. You're going to have to explain how you're going to hold these fossil fuel companies accountable. And I haven't heard any major Democratic politicians talk about that. Contrast Bernie Sanders' plan of how he's going to hold these fossil fuel companies accountable to how Barack Obama, the last Democratic president that we had in the United States, treated the fossil fuel industry. Forget prosecuting anyone in the fossil fuel industry. Forget prosecuting these executives or any of them. That wasn't even on Barack Obama's radar. For the most part, he was complicit in this shit. For his entire 8 years in office, Barack Obama was a loyal tool to the people who are profiting from the climate crisis that we're in right now. That's just a flat fact. Obama also hired people who are lobbyists and executives from the fossil fuel industry to work in his administration, just like Donald Trump's doing right now. Look how he treated the Keystone XL pipeline, a company that is already responsible for a large number of pollution in the United States already, poisoning millions of your citizens. They want to build another pipeline through the United States, an even bigger one, to bring even more toxic oil from Canada through the United States. And it's definitely going to leak, and it's definitely going to cause environmental problems. Barack Obama, how did he deal with that? He hemmed and he hawed for almost his entire administration about whether or not he was going to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. And then he finally was like, you know what? All right, we won't approve that one, even though there's a bunch of other pipelines that are approved, and we did fracking all over the country and all that shit. Even though we did all that, I'm just not going to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. Wow, that's so brave of you, Barack Obama. Even though if he wanted to, he could have directed his Department of Justice, just like Bernie Sanders is going to investigate them for all the fucked up shit that they're doing right now in the country. Fuck giving them allowing them to make even more money and build even more pipelines and poison even more people. That shouldn't even be in the realm of discussion. That shouldn't be in the spectrum of reasonable debate. The discussion around that energy company should be, okay, how are we going to hold them accountable for their role in the climate crisis that's happening right now? That should have been the discussion in the Obama administration, but he hemmed and hawed about whether or not he was going to allow them to build more pipelines, even dirtier pipelines that would definitely burst and poison even more people. He just hemmed and hawed about it and thought about whether or not he would do it for damn near his entire administration. Standing Rock, that was scary to watch. I'm not sure how into politics anybody who's listening to this, how into politics you were back when the whole Standing Rock situation was happening in 2016 and 2017. That was scary because in the way I saw it, that was the most flagrant violation of federal law and the Constitution I've ever seen within the United States. One of the most flagrant violations I've ever seen for the federal government and federal law and the Constitution. I touched on this earlier. They basically stole that land. Energy Transfer Partners stole that land to build that pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and that was Native American land that is federally protected. So even if it was just private property, the federal government would still have to step in and be like, whoa, what's going on here? You can't just steal people's private property and to build your pipeline so you can make billions of dollars. That is fucking insane. Even if it was just private property, the federal government should have stepped in and put an end to all that shit from the beginning. It was federally protected land, and Energy Transfer Partners said, fuck that shit, we're going to build a pipeline, and I dare Barack Obama and the federal government to say a word to me about it. Say word one to me about it. They brazenly built that pipeline for months. Department of Justice didn't do anything about it. Army Corps of Engineers ain't do a goddamn thing about it. While building the pipeline, Energy Transfer Partners, before you even build a pipeline in the United States, you have or something of that nature, you have to have the project, you have to have an environmental impact study on the project to see how it's going to impact people's lives in the surrounding area, as well as the environment. It is federal law that you have to do that study before any such project. Energy Transfer Partners also said, fuck it, I don't care. I dare the federal government to do something about it. I dare the Department of Justice or Barack Obama to come to me and say a word about it. They built they illegally built the pipeline anyway, even though a federal judge granted an injunction telling them that they had to stop. They did it anyway. Barack Obama looked the other way. And then when people were protesting all of this, the Energy Transfer Partners and their paid private security goons teamed up with the local law enforcement in North Dakota, and they brutalized lawful First Amendment protected protesters, peaceful protesters who were protesting the illegal building of this pipeline. They brutalized those people. Mass arrest. I believe over 400 people were arrested at Standing Rock. It could have been more than that, maybe closer to 600 in the 6 month span. You had journalists. So it's already unconstitutional and illegal to be arresting protesters, peaceful protesters. They were doing it. Journalists who were covering and reporting what was happening, like Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!, arrested, flagrantly violating the First Amendment again, and protections for journalists. And while doing all of that, it's not just that they're arresting people, they're actually assaulting people and brutalizing them. There was an incident during the whole Standing Rock, the DAPL protest, where the local police and the private security, they began hosing people down in freezing temperature with freezing cold water. The temperatures outside were below freezing, and they were hosing people down with cold water. There was mass hypothermia as a result of that. Hundreds of people had to go to the hospital or get medical treatment because they were assaulted with cold water in freezing temperatures. People could have died from that. Shooting people in the face point blank range with rubber coated steel bullets. There was a young woman who had her fucking arm blown off because they shot a tear gas canister at her with a fucking grenade launcher. So lawless as you can imagine, this whole Dakota Access Pipeline situation was. As lawless as you could imagine. If there was ever a time when the federal government was supposed to step in and say, whoa, what's going on here? The state government is out of hand, out of pocket. So is the local government, the law enforcement, the local law enforcement, the police department, completely violating people's civil rights and the Constitution. And you have this private company. They're doing all of this at the behest of this private company to build this pipeline that is going to poison the waterway, the drinking water for over 2 million people. If there was ever a time the federal government is supposed to step in and restore fucking order and rule of law, it would be right there at that DAPL protest. But Barack Obama sat there and watched that happen for months. For the end of his administration, he sat there and watched it happen, didn't lift a finger, didn't send and mind you, while this was happening, The world is watching. The world is watching in disgust. The UN had to send human rights observers because there were so many reports of human rights abuses at these protests. And while all this is happening, Barack Obama is sitting his ass in the White House. Doesn't send anybody from the Department of Justice to go see what's going on down there. Doesn't send order an FBI investigation. Doesn't order the Army Corps of Engineers to do anything about it, since it's technically federal land and is federally protected. Did nothing, didn't prosecute anybody, didn't open investigations into anybody. There's going to be a stark difference between how Bernie Sanders confronts the oil and fossil fuel industry compared to how Barack Obama did. Because Barack Obama was a fucking doormat. He was a loyal, faithful tool to the industry. He didn't push back too much. The most aggressive Obama got with the fossil fuel industry was maybe having some fines imposed or having some tax incentives to have them poison less people than they are right now. That was as aggressive and as tough as Barack Obama was willing to get on the fossil fuel industry. Well, Bernie Sanders isn't having any of that shit. He is going to crack down because they've known about the effects of climate change and they've exacerbated it for profit anyway. And in the process of doing that, they break a bunch of federal laws flagrantly and brazenly, and they dare anyone to call them out on it. So Bernie Sanders is going to call them on it, and he's going to check them, and he's going to open up investigations, and it's going to be extraordinary. And if you think he can't do it, it was already done by the federal government against the fossil fuel industry, I believe in the 90s. Against the tobacco industry in the 90s. Which brings me to another great part of this Green New Deal proposal from Bernie Sanders, which is the $40 billion he wants to set aside for climate justice resiliency fund, so that under-resourced groups like Native Americans, people with disabilities, and elderly people are able to prepare for climate change. And that's very important because a lot of people are going to have to move from their house when the climate crisis begins to get worse. A lot of people living in coastal communities in Florida, and I live in Florida, they're going to have to move from their house. Some estimates say that the entire city of Miami could be underwater in a couple decades. It's a real thing that people don't talk about. People don't talk about the fact that, yeah, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to have to move from their house, and the fact of the matter is they can't afford to do that right now. So what's going to happen to millions of people when their house is underwater? So that's something that nobody really addresses, and Bernie Sanders is going to put aside $40 billion to help these people relocate and help them prepare for what's going to happen with when the worst effects of climate change start to manifest here in the United States. And another great part of this plan is that it basically pays for itself. Like I mentioned at early on in this segment, there's this idea, this false idea that's been put out in the ether, whatever you want to call it, political discourse in the United States, that addressing climate change is going to be extremely costly and we might not be able to afford it, and we might just have to let the planet burn because we don't have the money to address this issue. Well, Bernie Sanders' plan, it costs $16 trillion. That sounds like a lot of money, right? Well, all that cost is covered without regular workers having to, I believe in a 10-year time frame, the green energy infrastructure that Bernie Sanders wants the federal government to create, will bring in $6.4 trillion in revenue. So part of his plan is to have the federal government a public option for the energy grid. If you can, instead of paying a private company for your energy, you pay the government, you pay your electric bill to the government. And the revenue that will create would be $6.4 trillion. And that's already covers a huge part of this Green New Deal proposal. Another $2.3 trillion just from the taxes on the jobs that will be created from this Green New Deal. So like I mentioned before, 20 million jobs created, and Bernie estimates $2.3 trillion in income taxes from those new jobs. And that's going to go towards paying the Green New Deal. And Bernie plans to save $1.2 trillion by reducing military expenses related to protecting oil shipping routes. Overall, this is a great proposal from Bernie Sanders. I love it. I love it. It's as bold as we need to be when it comes to addressing this climate crisis that we're in right now. Of course, there's room for it to go further, but this should be the baseline. This should be Bernie Sanders should be considered the standard bearer for the Democratic Party, all Democratic politicians on the issue of climate change. They should all agree to Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal proposal as a baseline, as a minimum. And of course, you could add on to that. AOCE has her plans for the high-speed rail and green infrastructure and public transportation and all that stuff. So yeah, you could add on to Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal and add on to with your own climate proposals. But that should be the baseline. And any Democrat who's trying to tell you, oh, Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal it's not feasible, it's not practical, it's not possible, or no, we have to work together with the fossil fuel industry, provide them some tax incentives, and we don't need to be so aggressive on them. Anybody who's saying any of that, anybody who's saying, oh, well, 20 million jobs, how are we going to create 20 million jobs? Any Democrat who's trying to make the argument against Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal proposal, just get out the way. Because your baby steps and your half measures and your incrementalism and your neoliberalism is not going to solve the problem. It's not going to address the crisis that we have in front of us at the moment. We need radical policies. We need revolutionary changes in our economy and our energy system if we're ever going to have a hope at protecting the environment and preventing the planet from fucking burning to the ground. Look, we're in the middle of a climate crisis right now. Just a couple months ago, the Trump administration, the U.S. government under the Trump administration, put out a report done by basically all different agencies in the government. Over 1,000 people contributed to this report, including 300 of the top climate scientists in the world. And that report was much in line with many of the other reports that we've been seeing recently about how dire the situation is regarding the climate crisis in the earth right now. The report warned of food shortages, drought, a mass immigration crisis across the globe, because eventually the Middle East is going to become so hot it is literally impossible for human beings to live there. So imagine all of the Middle Eastern countries, everybody have to evacuate. So we're talking about hundreds of millions, possibly billions of climate refugees. And that just puts a unbearable strain on governments and economies around the globe. Trying to relocate all those people at the same time. We're going to see more extreme weather events. More people are going to die from heat-related deaths because the temperature just keeps rising every month, every year. We keep breaking records for the hottest month or the hottest year on record. Sea level rise is going to cause a lot of coastal communities. People in those communities are going to have to move. Coastal cities like Miami might be completely underwater. So that's just a taste of what's to come if we don't drastically address this climate crisis within the next 10, 12 years. But I'd say that this issue has more traction than ever before because we're not just relying on predictions and forecasts from climate scientists about what our future might look like if we don't do something about this issue right now. People can see it with their own eyes. We see the catastrophic weather events. We see the record-breaking heat every single year. Every single year since probably like 2012, something like that, has been the hottest year on record consecutively. So 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, all the way to now, 2019, hottest years ever recorded. People are seeing the health effects from the pollution that these fossil fuel companies are causing. So there are real world effects happening right now that people can see. So that's why climate change consistently ranks as one of the most important issues to Democratic voters. Not just because of what we want to prevent in the future, because we're living in the climate crisis right now. So in this primary where we're supposed to be picking the nominee, I would think that it is a reasonable request that whoever the nominee is has an aggressive, radical climate policy plan to address climate change. I don't know how anybody can call themselves an environmentalist or say that they are concerned about the environment and protecting the environment. And I don't know how you can say that about yourself and not support Bernie Sanders and his Green New Deal proposal. That just doesn't make any sense to me. That doesn't make any sense. You can't say you care about the environment and you support some of these other candidates. The only other candidate who's even close to Bernie Sanders in terms of climate policy would be Tulsi Gabbard. But you can't tell me, oh yeah, I care about addressing the climate crisis, but I support Kamala Harris, or I support Joe Biden, or I support Pete Buttigieg or Beto O'Rourke. Because they all have shitty records and shitty policies to address the climate crisis. They don't go anywhere near far enough. And there is warranted skepticism about whether or not you can trust them to really make this a priority if they're president. No other candidates even close to Bernie Sanders on the issue of climate change. Kamala Harris, get the fuck out of here. There was just we were just in the middle of a news cycle dominated by everyone lambasting Kamala Harris, because instead of going to the first CNN town hall dedicated to climate change and how we're going to address the crisis, instead of doing that, taking that opportunity to explain to voters why you're the best equipped to handle the climate crisis, instead of taking that opportunity, Kamala Harris originally had declined an invitation from CNN, declined it, and she cited scheduling conflicts for why she declined to go to the CNN town hall. Well, the scheduling conflict was she had a fundraiser to go to with the donors. Kamala Harris would rather go and beg millionaires and billionaires for cash than actually propose and have some real discussions about addressing arguably the most important issue of our lifetime, the destruction of the planet. How are we going to prevent that in our lifetime, in the 10, 12-year span given to us by scientists? She thought it'd be more important to sell out and take bribes from billionaires and millionaires and corporate donors. That's what her priority was. And we expect her to go into the White House and be tough on Wall Street. Be tough on Wall Street banks who finance these oil companies, and also be tough on the fossil fuel industry. Yeah, right. On top of that, she was the Attorney General of California. She always brags about, she ran the second most powerful Justice Department in the United States, second only to the United States Department of Justice. What did she do when she was Attorney General of California to go after the fossil fuel industries and to go after the executives who are knowingly and willfully poisoning millions of people all throughout California with fracking and all the other fossil fuel related operations that they have going on in California? What did she do to protect her constituents and to go after the fossil fuel corporations and their executives? Not a goddamn thing. Where was her? She in her time that she's been in the Senate since 2017, where were any of her climate change proposals? She hasn't introduced any because she doesn't have any. To this point, she hasn't put out a serious, detailed, comprehensive climate change proposal. So if you say you care about climate change, you can't follow that up by saying I support Kamala Harris, because she's not going to do a goddamn thing about it. Similarly with Joe Biden. Joe Biden was part of this Democratic establishment that helped exacerbate the climate crisis. They weren't really a counter to the Republicans. They were just not as crazy as the Republicans when it came to giving a free pass to the fossil fuel industry. He was part of the Obama administration that sat back and let the whole Dakota Access Pipeline situation unfold. Joe Biden was sitting in that White House at the end of two terms, end of his 8 years in the White House with Barack Obama. He could have gone out and said, you know what, I'm going to spend some political capital. I'm going to put my neck out there. I'm going to stand up to the fossil fuel companies. I'm going to stand up to the North Dakota government. I'm going to stand up to Barack Obama, who's sitting there letting this shit happen. Joe Biden could have went out there and gave press conferences. He could have went to Standing Rock. He could have done a number of things when that was happening. Didn't say a goddamn word about it. All the other issues, Barack Obama administration, the administration Joe Biden was part of, had set the record for most oil production in the United States. It broke the record. Part of it, administration that approved fracking. Part of the administration that had Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State going country to country trying to strong arm governments into allowing U.S. oil companies and fossil fuel companies to do fracking in their countries and poison their people. Joe Biden was part of that administration. the same administration who's going around bragging about the Paris Climate Accords as if it was some radical flaming lefty proposal to address the climate crisis. Weak sauce. Oh, we're going to provide tax incentives for the oil companies. Oh, we're going to reduce carbon emissions by 10% over 200 years. That was the Paris Climate Accord that Joe Biden thought was so revolutionary, and so radical. And honestly, and in his on the campaign trail right now, part of his climate change plan is to get back into the Paris Climate Accord. He thinks that's like some big bold agenda to address climate change, get back into the Paris Climate Accord. I'm sure, as you guys remember, early on in the campaign trail, after Joe Biden got into the race, he was asked about what he was going to do to address climate change, and his response is, we need to find a middle ground. We're going to have to find a middle ground approach between the environmentalists and the activists and the lefties who actually want to save the planet and, I don't know, keep it from fucking burning, and the lobbyists and the fossil fuel corporations and the executives who are making billions of dollars in profit by exacerbating the climate crisis and destroying the planet. We need to find a middle ground approach between those two. That was Joe Biden early on in the campaign. And I believe that he has some type of coal lobbyist or oil lobbyist working on his campaign. I believe they actually helped write his climate proposal. So you can't say you care about the environment and then support Joe Biden, because Joe Biden is going to, if he has his way, he'll let the fossil fuel companies continue to pollute this planet until it's too late to actually address climate change. That's what Joe Biden would do if he was in the White House. And Elizabeth Warren, she came out with all of her weak sauce half measures to address climate change. Originally, it was her Green New Deal plan for the military, where she frames it as, in order for us to continue our military operations and for our military to keep doing the job that they're doing around the world, we're going to make sure that they're using green technology. So she has this whole convoluted plan where she's going to cut carbon emissions for the Pentagon with all these investments in green technology and all that stuff, and upgrading all the military bases, instead of just taking the more straightforward approach like Bernie Sanders seems to be taking in his Green New Deal proposal, which is, how about we just cut a lot of these military operations, and not only are we going to save money that we could put into green technology, but we'd also get rid of all the fucking carbon that they're emitting, because we cut down drastically on the military operations. So close a bunch of the military bases, end the wars, end these endless wars in the Middle East that are all over Africa that we're dropping bombs, because that releases a lot of pollution into the atmosphere and contributes to climate change, dropping bombs and doing drone strikes and shit like that. So ending wars would radically reduce the carbon footprint of the U.S. military. All of those things would be more straightforward, faster, and more effective than Elizabeth Warren's plan to cut the carbon emissions for the military. But she doesn't take that. Instead, she takes the half measure, which is, okay, let's have all this giant, expansive U.S. empire that's obviously going to waste a bunch of money and is the number one polluter in the planet. Let's continue that, but let's do that in a green and efficient way. Like how Bernie Sanders has a real plan to go after the fossil fuel industry and do criminal investigations into their actions. That's how Bernie Sanders plans to hold them accountable. How does Elizabeth Warren plan to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable? One of her proposals is that she's gonna require the fossil fuel companies to disclose a risk assessment for climate change. So basically, she wants them to make public how much they factor in the effects of climate change into their cost of business. That's what she wants to do. She wants them to make public basically their expense reports, what their cost of business is and how climate change would affect that. That's how she plans to hold them accountable. Again, always with the half measures and the weak sauce with Elizabeth Warren. So on climate change, she's not anywhere near Bernie Sanders. You can't say you support climate change and then it's your number one issue, it's so important to you, but then say, I'm going to back Elizabeth Warren because I trust that she's going to be the best at addressing the climate crisis. Like, that is not congruent. That does not add up. Those two things do not mix. And also with Elizabeth Warren, you have the added factor, just like with every other issue, is I just don't trust her. Where are all these proposals when you were in the Senate for however many years? Where were all these proposals when you were sitting quiet and keeping your powder dry during your entire time in the Senate? You haven't put out any climate proposals. You haven't put out any climate change policies. You haven't done anything of substance. So it rings hollow when you do it on the campaign trail, just like with every other issue with Elizabeth Warren. And like I mentioned earlier, the only other candidate who's anywhere close to Bernie Sanders on the issue of climate change is Tulsi Gabbard. She put out that off act years ago now, way before she was running for president, way before she thought she would be running for president. And it was one of the most comprehensive pieces of legislation to address the climate crisis ever to be introduced in the House. Now, I think Bernie Sanders' plan goes even farther and is more comprehensive than Tulsi Gabbard's, so I don't even think she matches him there. But she's close. She's the closest out of all the other candidates. Now, if we're being real, it's not looking too good for Tulsi Gabbard. She might not make it on the debate stage in September. And if she doesn't make it in the debate stage, I don't know how much further her campaign is going to last. So this is an amazing proposal from Bernie Sanders. I think we're at a time right now where it's looking very bad for the human race and this whole experiment that we have going on here, because the more time goes by, the less faith I have in humanity to be able to actually get our shit together to address the climate crisis and all these other crises that we are facing, or else facing mass extinction. I don't see us, the more time goes by, I don't see us actually being able to rise to the challenge. But Bernie Sanders, always coming through my darkest hour to provide a ray of hope with some real serious substance, some policy substance that nobody else even comes close to. So I love this proposal from Bernie Sanders. And like I said, nobody on that campaign trail is coming close to Bernie Sanders when it comes to on the issue of climate change, as well as any other issue you want to go down the list of. So